I'm curious when it comes to apologies if there's any research based on time. Do we want to apologize or acknowledge some kind of wrongdoing within a certain amount of time, maybe 24 hours or 48 hours? And is an apology considered more sincere or perceived as more sincere or impactful if it's done within a certain amount of time?
Absolutely. That's a great question, and one that scholars have only recently begun to start to investigate, because much of the attention before was on what is an apology made up of? How do we have it? How does it help with forgiveness or conflict management in our relationships? But some of the current research, in fact, some research that I have done with a couple of colleagues had to do with the timing of an apology. And what we looked at was whether or not, roughly speaking, if apologizing earlier or later would be helpful. So not in terms of this time frame that this listener had spoke about, but actually a shorter time frame. So in our particular study, what we had done is we had people discuss recurring conflicts in their relationship. So these were couples who were dating or married, and then they have, as couples do, they have topics that they tend to have conflicts about over and over again. So they're not really resolved until the next time they come up again. And so we had people talk about these sorts of topics, and we had people explain who was the person who you thought was more blameworthy for the situation, right? To try to make it as realistic as possible. So the person who was thought to be most blameworthy or responsible, we asked that person on the side to apologize to their partner at some point during a conversation. And we asked them to do it either earlier or later in the discussion. And what we found is that, and one other aspect for you to know is that we only allowed people roughly 10 minutes to have this conflict. We didn't want it to go extensively. So that's a limitation in the study. But in those 10 minutes, when people had those recurring conflict discussions and they ended within those 10 minutes, what happened is that when people apologized later on, so we're talking like roughly around 6 minutes or so into the discussion compared to around 2 minutes, a minute and a half in the discussion, the people who apologized later were seen as more sincere. The person who was receiving the apology felt more understood and felt happier about the actual interaction. Even though we're talking about something that's been an ongoing issue in the relationship, they felt happier when the apologies happened later. Now, all bets were off when we had to interrupt their conflict and they were still going on, right? They were still going at it. So we don't know what happens after that, but there's some evidence that suggests that later apologies might be more beneficial.
Why is that?
So what we think is going on, and another study that had looked at this before had looked at vignettes instead, but the same sort of pattern held true, is that people felt more understood because they felt like they were able to say what the issue was. So when you're apologizing, remember that rupture? You're trying to say you're sorry for something that happened, and you want people to see you in a different light, right? You want to say, I'm apologizing. I don't want you to think that this is an accurate representation of me. So I'm going to show you that I have regret for that and that I understand what it was that I did. So if you apologize early on, how did you understand what went on? Now, so an earlier apology might work if it was a simple idea, a simple transgression, right? You bumped into somebody, you don't want to wait, right, 6 minutes and say, oops, sorry, right? But you say it right away, right? But that's because that's a simple, you have a clear understanding of what it is. When something is more complex and needs some more sort of depth and discussion and communication around that, then later apologies tend to work better because it shows that now you have a fuller or more complete understanding of what you're apologizing for, which then fuels perceptions of sincerity. So then you look more sincere, right, when you apologize later, because now you know what was going on.
Listen, subscribe, and follow to help keep this podcast alive. Mahalo.